They call them angels of death, the shining wrath of the Emperor made flesh. But every angel casts a shadow, and the shadow of the Adeptus Astartes stretches farther than any light they serve. There are things even the High Lords will not speak of, things buried beneath cathedrals of silence and oceans of secrecy. I learned this truth not from scripture, but from the sound of a bolter's safety disengaging behind me in a chamber where no mortal was supposed to stand. The Space Marines are humanity's champions. Yet the closer one looks, the more their perfection unravels into horror. What if the gene seed that grants their strength also carries a curse? What if their loyalty is a ritual, not a choice? And what if the Emperor himself ordered that the truth of their creation be hidden, not from his enemies but from his own species? If you've ever looked at an Astartes and felt awe tinged with unease, you already sense it, the paradox that sustains the Imperium. Today we descend through the layers of that paradox, from the shining armor to the blood beneath it, and perhaps by the end, you'll understand why even angels fear the light that made them. Before we begin, remember, if you want more stories that peel back the armor of the Imperium and reveal the living souls, or what's left of them, beneath, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this chronicle. It helps our small archive survive the censors of the administratum, and ensures more of these forbidden histories reach curious minds like yours. The Children of Thunder. The first sound I remember was thunder. Not the storm-born kind that rolls across skies, but the deep, measured detonations that echo through the bones of Terra itself. The sound of machinery birthing gods. They said the Emperor's laboratories never slept, that in the vaults beneath the Himalaysian mountains, the air was so charged with psychic residue that lightning sometimes bloomed from the walls like flowers of light. Those who worked there walked beneath that eternal storm, heads bowed, hands trembling, for they knew what they were building was not meant for mortal comprehension. We call them Space Marines now, the Adeptus Astartes. But in those first days, before the armor, before the ceremony, they were only test subjects, gene vessels, half-born things writhing in vats of nutrient fluid as the Emperor and his gene artisans rewrote the blueprint of humanity. The laboratories stank of ozone and blood. Servo arms whispered above rows of suspended bodies, their skin translucent as wet paper. The light of the lumens flickered with every pulse of psychic interference, and the scribes of the Mechanicum chanted Binharic prayers to keep the machines from tearing themselves apart. The Emperor stood at the center of it all, silent, unmoving, a golden statue come to life. They said his eyes could see down to the atom, that he could trace the pattern of a man's soul like a cartographer reading a map of eternity. Around him were the biologist adepts of the Mechanicum, the proto-apothecaries who would later serve the legions. They worked with surgical reverence, their tools humming like hymns. Every incision was a sacrament, every graft a prayer. The first subjects died screaming. Flesh could not yet bear the weight of perfection. Bones fractured under the strain of accelerated growth. Lungs collapsed under forced adaptation. The Emperor watched each death in silence. Some say he mourned them. Others say he catalogued the failures without emotion, as a craftsman corrects flaws in his design. Perhaps both were true. No record remains of what he thought as his children died before his eyes. Only the results remain, stronger, faster, more stable iterations, each closer to the ideal. When the thunder finally ceased, when the last surge of lightning faded from the air, the first true Astartes opened his eyes. He rose from the vat in silence, the fluid dripping from his skin like molten gold in the cold light. No one spoke. The Emperor stepped forward, his hand resting briefly upon the warrior's brow. The gesture was simple, almost human, but the effect was seismic. Those who witnessed it swore the air itself bowed in reverence. In that instant, the Emperor had done something no mortal had ever achieved. He had rewritten humanity. They called that first generation the Thunder Warriors, though later the name would be whispered like a curse. They were not the refined Astartes that followed, but brutal, unstable prototypes. Warriors made for conquest, not endurance. Their rage burned hotter than Prometheum. Their loyalty bound not by faith but by the Emperor's will alone. They conquered Terra in his name, breaking the techno-barbarian hordes, burning the gene warlords and their abominations from the soil of mankind's cradle. They ended Old Night with blade and bolt, their advance a storm of blood and lightning. Yet even as the Emperor's banners rose over the blackened ruins of the world, those who worked in the laboratories knew the truth. The Thunder Warriors were dying. Their bodies aged too fast, their organs devoured themselves from within. The very enhancements that made them gods also doomed them to ruin. There are reports, fragmentary, forbidden, that some begged for release, that others went mad, turning on one another in the ruins they had conquered. The Emperor watched it all and said nothing. Perhaps he had already foreseen their end. Perhaps that had always been the plan. When the last of the Thunder Warriors fell, their corpses were burned in silence. No monuments marked their passing, no songs were sung. Their names were erased, their gene seed harvested and refined into something purer, colder, the foundation for the Astartes who would follow. The Emperor called them the Children of Thunder, but they never heard the name. It was spoken only in the laboratories, in whispers, as if the word itself carried danger. Because those who created gods had learned the first rule of divinity. Even perfection has a price, and the universe always collects. Some say the Thunder Warriors were not truly gone. That beneath the palace, in catacombs sealed with golden sigils, a few still remain, alive but unmoving, held in suspension by the Emperor's will. Not dead, not alive. A reminder, perhaps, or a warning. Because if the Emperor could unmake his first creations without hesitation, what mercy could any of his later sons expect? The birth of the Astartes was not a miracle. It was an autopsy performed on hope. The thunder began it. The silence that followed made it holy. They told us the Thunder Warriors were legends, nothing more. That the Emperor's true sons, the Adeptus Astartes, were the perfected form. Stable, loyal, everlasting. But in the quiet corners of the Schola archives, where the light of the lumen never quite reached, I found records that suggested otherwise. Data slates warped by time, sealed Vox recordings in dialects no one spoke anymore, and among them, one name repeated in dozens of conflicting scripts, erased and rewritten over centuries: Project Thunderchild. It was said to have been the bridge between the Thunder Warriors and the Astartes, a transitory generation, born not in the laboratories beneath the Himalaysian mountains but within the orbital manufactorums of Luna. Here, flesh met machinery in a new kind of faith. The Mechanicum called it divine integration, the Emperor called it necessity, and the subjects called it nothing at all. For most never lived long enough to speak. The process began with children. Always children, recruited or more often taken from the war-torn ruins of Terra. They were chosen for their resilience, their adaptability, their potential to endure the torment of transformation. Some believed the Emperor saw something in them, a spark that could be fanned into divinity. Others whispered that he simply needed material strong enough not to disintegrate under his hand. They were stripped of names, numbers burned into their skin, memories cleansed by hypno-indoctrination until even their own reflections seemed alien. In the sterile chambers of Luna's genetic foundries, they were opened and remade piece by piece. Bones hollowed and reinforced with adamantium. Hearts replaced with twin-chambered engines of muscle and steel. Blood laced with catalytic enzymes that shimmered like liquid light. Every heartbeat drew them farther from humanity. I remember reading a line from one Mechanicus observer. They do not scream like men. They hum, as though the flesh itself prays while it burns. The first stable Astartes emerged from those foundries, stronger than the Thunder Warriors, more controlled, capable of surviving the psychic fields that radiated from the Emperor's presence. But with that stability came something else: silence. They did not laugh. They did not dream. Their faces were masks of devotion, carved by conditioning and prayer. There was one, however, whose story did not fit the pattern. His name, if it can be trusted, was Elion, a neophyte of the early gene batches assigned to the Iveth Proto-Legion. Records suggest he retained fragments of memory from before the induction, images of the surface, of rain on broken glass, of a mother's hand that smelled of engine oil and fear. These memories became anomalies during hypno-training, flashes that resisted erasure. His handlers reported emotional instability and pre-conversion sentimentality. But instead of purging him, they observed. Elion's performance in combat simulations exceeded expectations. His empathy made him unpredictable, his instincts sharper. It was said that when the Emperor himself walked among the test chambers, his gaze lingered upon the young Astartes longer than the others. Not with affection, but with curiosity, as though he were watching something he had not intended to create. Months later, the Iveth Legion's first deployment began. The Proto-Legions were unleashed upon the sub-equatorial wastes of Terra, where the last Technoclan still resisted the unification. Elion fought there alongside hundreds like him. The campaign lasted 3 days. The resistance was obliterated. When the surviving Astartes returned, Elion was missing. Official records list him as lost to environmental collapse. Unofficial reports mention something else: that his body was found weeks later in the ruins, seated against a shattered column, helm removed, a bolt pistol pressed beneath his jaw. A single line was carved into the stone beside him in High Gothic. "We have become the storm, and storms do not weep." The entry was stricken from Mechanicus archives by order of the Emperor's custodians. The stone was destroyed, yet the phrase survived, passed down among the gene smiths like a curse. Storms do not weep. A reminder, perhaps, that to perfect humanity, one must first kill everything human within it, and so, from the ashes of Project Thunderchild rose the legions proper, the Emperor's final sons, the true angels of death. Their creation ended the Age of Thunder and began the Age of Conquest. The Great Crusade would soon ignite the stars themselves, but the thunder never truly left. It only learned to whisper. Chapter 2. The Voice Beneath the Throne. The throne hummed, eternal and patient. Its vibrations crawled into the bones, deeper than any cathedral's foundations, older than any memory recorded by man. The lights of the imperial palace above were a distant fire, faint against the shadowed arteries that carried power and faith into the heart of Terra. Down here no hymn could reach, no organ could resonate. Only the machinery whispered, and in its whisper, I heard something else, a voice ancient and trembling, buried beneath the weight of 10,000 years. They call the lowest depths the Selenite Deep, though no chart names it, no scribe dares to record it. Even the custodians rarely pass the 50th layer. The air there is thick, heavy with the pulse of forgotten prayers, a blend of incense, oil, and something older, metallic and alive. Servitors patrol the corridors, their flesh fused to metal in grotesque devotion, eyes glowing with the dim light of unthinking vigilance. Yet in their endless steps I felt the rhythm of something else, a heartbeat, faint, fractured, and human. I found it by accident, or perhaps by design, a signal, weak, buried beneath layers of encryption older than the Great Crusade, flickered across my instruments. I traced it cautious, the light of my lumen trembling against the polished black walls, and then I heard the words, faint, mechanical, mournful. Still here, still serving. It was nothing and everything, 3 words that shattered my understanding of devotion. I had walked the halls of the throne before, knelt before its altar and felt the presence of the Emperor as the Ministorum describes. Distant, immutable, unbroken. But this was different. It was not command. It was memory, a fragment of the impossible, a shard of divinity that whispered through time. To follow it, I had to descend through paths no living human was meant to walk. Maintenance hatches, forgotten tunnels, air choked with fumes of promethium and the residue of centuries-old machinery. Every level deeper stole warmth from my armor. Every shadow seemed to breathe. When I finally arrived at the chamber's threshold, I found a vast room lined with crystal towers and brass conduits, machinery that pulsed as if alive. At its center, seated upon a throne of bone and metal, was a figure. Its flesh was desiccated, blackened with age. Its eyes glowed faint gold, the same light the texts say once shone in the Emperor himself. It moved then, slowly, with a weight that bent the air around it. Its voice reached me directly, bypassing the vox, piercing my skull. Do not be afraid, it was not him. Not entirely. But it was of him a remnant, a fragment of consciousness that had endured the centuries. It had seen everything, carried the weight of humanity in its vigilance, and yet it was tired. Older than the oldest archivist, older than Terra itself, I asked, trembling, what it was. And it replied, a shard. What remains when duty takes everything away. Duty. That word reverberated like a drumbeat through the chamber. Here was devotion made flesh, or rather, devotion left behind when flesh could no longer contain it. It was neither alive nor dead, neither mortal nor divine. It was a whisper, a reflection, a fragment sustained by machinery older than any soul above, and still it served. The room pulsed with 1,000 hidden echoes. Shapes half buried in crystal machinery flickered, their forms shifting, their eyes glowing faintly as if in silent prayer. They do not come here anymore, the voice murmured. They forget what feeds the light. I understood then. Not blood alone sustained the Astronomicon. Not sacrifice alone. Memory, will, fragments of humanity offered endlessly, woven into the fabric of the Emperor's presence. Every prayer, every soul, every whisper of obedience fed the beacon that guided the Imperium through the warp. And here, in the shadow beneath the throne, it all accumulated, a choir that no hymn could encompass. I dropped to my knees, powerless, awed. And you? What are you? I whispered. I am what remains. What watches when the throne cannot? What remembers when the galaxy forgets? We serve. The chant began then, soft at first, almost imperceptible. Still here. Still serving. The voices multiplied, human and machine and something in between, echoing through the chamber in waves. I could feel them in my bones, in my blood, in the rhythm of my breath. And for a moment I understood the true weight of the Imperium. Not the wars, not the fleets, not even the Emperor himself, but the silent, endless service of those who never see the light, yet keep it burning. I left that chamber changed. The ascent was a blur. Lights and shadows melted together as the throne above grew nearer, the voices fading yet never gone. When I returned to the surface, the palace seemed smaller, quieter. Yet I felt the pulse of that hidden choir beneath my feet, and in my dreams I still hear it, faint and endless, whispering through the night. Still here, still serving. Even now I wonder if it answers back. The air beneath the imperial palace is not air at all. It is cold metal, a whisper of ozone and the hum of machinery older than any memory. I had descended once before, following a signal so faint it could have been my imagination, yet it carried a weight no mortal should bear. The corridors of the selenite deep are unmarked on any map. Maintenance hatches sealed for centuries open only to servitors whose flesh has fused with the bronze of their bodies, moving like shadows cast by light that never shines. It is said even the Adeptus Custodes hesitate beyond the 50th layer. I did not hesitate because curiosity is a heresy, and I was already guilty. The signal pulsed once every 3 hours, hidden beneath layers of encryption that predated the Horus heresy. When I tuned the vox frequency, words came through, fractured, mechanical, human. Still here, still serving. 3 words, and yet they unmade sleep for days. Every doctrine of the Ministorum declares the Emperor eternal, his mind a beacon across the warp. But the fragment I glimpsed whispered of something more intimate, an echo of flesh, a remnant of divinity tethered to duty. The lift doors closed above me, sealing my descent. Darkness deepened, the chill gnawing at my armor until even the light of my lumen seemed feeble. When the corridor opened into the first chamber, I found it alive in ways I could not describe. Crystalline towers hummed with energy, brass conduits pulsed with faintly human rhythm, and cables writhed like serpents, feeding into a throne that was at once machine and body. It sat there, a figure half-fleshed, half-arcane construct. Its eyes glowed with golden light, dim, flickering, yet impossibly present. "Do not be afraid," it said, not with sound but with thought. Its voice trembled with exhaustion, with awareness, with memory of all that it had lost. I fell to my knees, the lumen rolling across the floor. "My lord, is it you?" The figure tilted its head. "Not him," it whispered, "but of him. What remains when duty takes everything else away." In that moment the enormity of what I had found struck me. This was no god in the open. This was a shard, a reflection, a consciousness devoted so utterly that it had forgotten self, remembered only purpose. Around the throne I glimpsed others, shapes suspended in crystal, half-seen, silent witnesses to a devotion older than memory. They pulsed with the same mantra, the same pulse. Still here, still serving. I asked what I should do. It smiled, sorrowful, almost human. "Remember," it said, "tell them he still dreams, even if they no longer believe." The walls whispered with static, the chorus of fragments vibrating through the air. When I retreated, the lift and hatches no longer recognized my presence. The surface seemed untouched, but beneath the selenite deep waited. Its secrets were patient, its choir eternal, and sometimes in the quiet of my hab I can still hear it, still here. Still serving, not a warning, not a prayer, but a call, and I know if I return it will speak again. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Forgotten Wars. Word of the Emperor's will does not travel evenly. It moves like a shadow stretched across the stars, shaped by the whims of fleets, the panic of planets, the blind devotion of billions. I have seen worlds die quietly, unnoticed, while the Imperium celebrates victories elsewhere. I have seen men cling to hope in the choking smoke of their own extinction. And I have heard the whispers of those who claim to know the throne's secrets, though their tongues betray them. The first battlefield I witnessed was nothing like the parades of honor described in the Ministorum. It was a hovel world on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, a planet that had once prospered and now lay in ruin, its cities reduced to jagged skeletons of metal and stone. The air was thick with the scent of promethium and iron, with ash clinging to every inhalation. The inhabitants had fled or died long before the Adeptus Astartes arrived, leaving only the echoes of fear and prayer for us to follow. I rode with a squad of the Iveth Legion, neophytes from the earliest post-Thunderchild gene batches, their armor still raw, their voices quiet in awe and terror, They did not speak of glory, nor of honor, only of the duty etched into their bones and the silent question: could they survive the day without losing themselves? The answer was written in the ground: craters where entire regiments had vanished, sky choked with the remnants of fallen craft, and the dead faces of civilians staring through collapsed walls, their eyes unseeing yet accusing. The orcs were there, of course. Brutish, gleeful predators whose green flesh seemed immune to fear or reason. Their war cries tore through the smoke like living thunder, and yet even in their chaos there was structure, a cunning born of instinct that made them formidable. The Astartes moved among them like shadows of myth, striking with precision that was almost cruel in its inevitability. Each blow shattered bone, each strike was prayer and execution intertwined. And all the while I felt it, the presence of something greater, a subtle tug in the warp that reminded me of the throne, as though the Emperor's will stretched even here, across light years and death. The battle was not a spectacle of heroes. It was endurance, survival, and the quiet horror of witnessing the expendable nature of human life. The civilians, the Adeptus Administratum, even the neophytes. None of us were more than a single note in a symphony of destruction. And yet, in that orchestra of ruin I glimpsed something else. The shimmer of possibility, a spark that could endure despite the overwhelming darkness. I remember Elyon, though I had not known him by name at the time. He moved differently from the others. Not faster, not stronger, he was already faster and stronger, but with awareness. A calculation that made him almost human in his unpredictability. He paused once mid-combat, as if listening to the pulse of the planet itself, the cries of the dying, the rhythm of the warp bleeding through reality. And then he struck with a precision that no Astartes training could account for, severing the war boss's skull in a single motion. The orcs screamed, scattered, and the world remained unbowed but not unscarred. When the smoke cleared, I walked among the survivors. Not all were human, not all lived, and yet all were witnesses. The Iveth Legion gathered silently, tending to the wounded, cataloging the fallen, their faces masks of devotion. And through it all I felt again that low, persistent hum, the distant heartbeat of the throne, faint but real, reminding us that even here, amid ruin and death, the Emperor's consciousness reached outward. It did not guide our hands directly. It shaped the currents around us, nudging events, whispering decisions through instinct rather than command. But shadows lingered. Tyranids had passed through the system before, probing, testing, and their psychic residue lingered like a stain in the warp. Cults of heretics thrived in the ruins, twisting the memories of the dead into prayers of defiance. Chaos had already begun its work, and I realized that no matter how far the throne reached, the Imperium's enemies never rested. Victory was ephemeral. Survival was a temporary grace purchased in blood. That night, beneath a sky blackened with smoke, I heard the voices again. Not the fragment beneath the throne. Not fully, but echoes, human, synthetic, something in between, singing across the stars.
Still here.
Still serving. The words carried not only from Terra, but from every battlefield, every manufactorum, every chapel where men and women prayed in the dark. The Imperium existed in those shadows as much as in the gilded halls of the palace, and it was in the shadows that the cost of our devotion became clear. I understood then that service is never seen, never rewarded. It is endurance. It is sacrifice, multiplied until meaning becomes unbearable, until the faintest spark of hope is all that sustains a galaxy. And even as the Iveth Legion returned to orbit, leaving behind a world that would rebuild slowly, painfully, I felt the weight of the unseen choir, guiding, observing, never resting. We were Legion. We were memory. We were the instruments of the Emperor's will, and we carried the echoes of countless deaths as both shield and sword. The shadows of the forgotten wars stretched long across the Imperium, and I had only begun to walk among them. The next day, or what passed for day beneath a sky still choked with ash, the Ivth Legion regrouped on the plateau overlooking the shattered city. Smoke rose from the crumbled spires like pale ghosts reaching for a sun that no longer existed. I followed Elian at a distance, watching the way he moved, not merely through space but through intention itself. Every motion carried weight, every gesture measured, as if the terrain itself spoke and he alone understood its language. We discovered the remnants of an orc warband in the lower districts, scavengers and looters who had survived the main battle only to starve, to gnaw on one another in a frenzy of desperation. Elian did not hesitate. His strikes were precise, surgical in their brutality, but there was a pause between each kill, almost imperceptible, where his head tilted slightly, listening. I thought at first he sought the next target, but it became clear he was listening to something else, the rhythm beneath the surface, a pulse that others could not perceive. I felt it too, faint and distant, like the echo of a bell that had long ceased ringing. The Emperor's will, or perhaps a fragment of it, seemed to brush against my mind in those moments, subtle yet undeniable. It did not dictate our actions. It did not command. It merely observed, weighed, and whispered suggestions in a language older than any star. And in that whisper, I began to understand why Elian had survived the early trials, why he had been allowed to retain what little of his past remained. He could hear it. He could understand the cadence of duty itself, the underlying rhythm of service, the pulse of a galaxy held together by invisible threads. By midday, we reached the edge of the Manufactorum ruins where the planetary defenses had once processed promethium and refined ore. There the ground shivered beneath us, not from tremors but from the latent energy stored in buried reactors, their cores cracked yet still humming with life. Elian knelt, placing his gauntleted hand upon the cold metal, and I swear I saw the surface of the reactor ripple, as though it were a pool disturbed by a single drop. The hum grew louder, harmonizing with the distant pulse I had felt all morning.
Still here.
Still serving. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, carried not through sound but through the marrow, the blood, the nerves themselves. It was a reminder, a warning, and a promise all at once. The Imperium endured not because men understood, but because they obeyed, because they persisted. And in that persistence, even amidst ruin and death, there was a faint, almost imperceptible hope. Chaos found us before night fell. A scouting fleet, warped and twisted by the touch of the warp, emerged from the system's outer edges. Their arrival was heralded not by fire or flame, but by an oppressive stillness, a silence that pressed against the ears and the mind alike. Elian raised his helm, scanning the void with sensors attuned to the slightest distortion. I felt the whisper again, stronger now, urging caution.
Not yet, not yet.
The warning was immediate and visceral. We were not to strike blindly, for the cost would be unbearable. And then came the Tyranids. Small scouting tendrils at first, bioships crawling through real space like insects, probing, testing, sensing. The hum beneath my skin surged, warning of the danger, cataloging threats before they became action. Elian's hand rested briefly on my shoulder, grounding me, steadying me. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. In the silence, in the spaces between heartbeats, we understood each other, and perhaps for a moment, we understood the Emperor's reach, stretched across light years and death, threading through the minds of his sons like an invisible lattice. The battle that followed was not cinematic. It was chaos distilled, the kind that leaves only the raw edges of perception intact. Bolter fire tore through the fog of biochemical clouds. Chains, words, and claws carved the air, leaving trails of energy and fury. Yet every movement, every strike seemed choreographed, not by the minds of men but by the weight of inevitability itself. We were instruments of a rhythm older than the stars, and I could feel it coursing through every bone in my body, syncing with the cadence of death and survival. Hours passed, perhaps minutes, perhaps days. Time, as it had before in the presence of the Emperor's will, folded into itself, meaningless in the face of such orchestration. When the last of the tyrannid tendrils fell, the field lay in ruin, but it was not silent. The hum persisted, low, constant, reverberating through metal, flesh, and bone. It was a reminder, even in victory there was no rest. Service never ended, duty never ceased, and the voice remained echoing from some hidden heart of the galaxy, in a language older than men, older than the Emperor himself. We did not speak as we returned to orbit. Words would have broken the fragile clarity that hung over us. I watched Elion, helmet raised to the stars, and I wondered how many of the early gene batches had survived such trials intact. How many carried remnants of memory, fragments of identity, and yet had become perfect instruments of war. And I understood finally why legends whispered that the first warriors were not gods, they were shadows. Shadows of the Emperor's ambition. Shadows of what humanity could become when stripped to its essence and reforged in fire. The 5th Legion did not celebrate. The fleet moved silently through the void, each vessel a tomb for those who had fallen, each crew member a witness to horrors that could never be recounted in the light of the Imperium. And still, as we drifted among the stars, the whisper persisted. Not through vox, not through auguries, but through the marrow of every soul present. Still here, still serving. And in that whisper I realized the terrible truth. The Emperor's reach was infinite, but it was maintained not by his divinity alone, nor by his power, but by the silent devotion of countless voices. Countless deaths, countless shadows, and we, the living instruments of that devotion, were bound forever to the service of a galaxy that would never rest, never pause, never forgive. The shadows of the forgotten wars stretched longer than the stars themselves, and I for one would continue to walk among them, carrying their weight, hearing their whispers, answering their call. Chapter 4. The Fractured Light. The galaxy is older than memory, but not older than suffering. I saw it then, in the void between systems where the light of distant stars barely touched the shadowed hulls of our fleet. The 5th Legion drifted among the wreckage of war, a procession of silent guardians, each vessel a tomb and a fortress. Elion stood on the bridge of the flagship, shoulders squared against the subtle pull of the warp, his eyes tracing constellations that existed only in charts older than the Imperium itself. There was a stillness to him that unnerved even the oldest of the sergeants, a sense that he was not merely observing the galaxy but listening to it, reading the spaces between worlds as if they were lines of scripture. The voice beneath the throne had not left me. It haunted the edges of thought, threading through dreams, whispering half-formed truths. Still here, still serving. I realized with a weight that pressed against my chest that these words were not mere echoes. They were a lattice, a scaffold that held the Imperium itself together. Each whispered syllable was a fragment of devotion, a shard of consciousness embedded in the machinery of reality. The Astronomicon was more than a beacon. It was a mind fractured yet whole, a light held together by sacrifice, memory, and will. And yet, even as I understood this, I knew its edges were fraying. The first signs came subtly. Worlds lost to the void, systems swallowed by warp storms that should have been contained. Fleets arriving late, their crews broken, minds unraveling under the psychic weight of the Astronomicon's strain. It was as though the light itself shivered, not from lack of power, but from the impossibility of sustaining infinity. Elion did not speak of these failures. He did not need to. I felt them all the same, as if the pulse beneath the throne had expanded to touch us directly. Then came the visions. Not dreams, not projections, but slices of the galaxy as it truly was. I saw Terra from orbit, a world shrouded in fire and gold, the golden throne at its center pulsing like a fractured heart. The choir, those who served directly within the throne's psychic lattice, moved not as individuals but as instruments, each thought a note in a symphony too vast for comprehension. And through them, through the constant grinding devotion of billions, I glimpsed the fragments of the Emperor's own consciousness. They were not fully sentient, not in the sense of a human mind, but they remembered. They mourned, they judged, and they acted. A transmission reached us then, carried not through vox or data slate but through the psychic resonance that bound the choir together. It was a report, faint and fragmented from the edges of the segmentum obscurus, a world lost to the Tyranids, its defense fleets crushed before they could lift weapons, its population devoured before the first warning could reach Terra. Elion's gaze did not falter. He traced the source of the resonance, feeling the pain as though it were his own, and then he acted not with orders or commands, but with intent. Systems rerouted, reinforcements deployed, warp currents shifted. The light, fractured and strained, bent to his will, not because he was a god, but because he was a part of the lattice, and the lattice responded to all who served within it. I began to understand what the selenite deep had shown me. The fragments beneath the throne were not idle. They were not relics of apotheosis. They were instruments of survival, bound to the will of the Imperium, yet each carrying a fragment of awareness, a shard of self, and each fragment suffered. Each fragment burned. Each fragment remembered what it meant to be human, and it grieved. The war in the segmentum obscurus escalated. Orc fleets surged from uncharted voids. Bioships carved through space with tyrannical purpose, and the influence of chaos seeped into systems previously thought secure. Yet through it all the lattice held. Elion moved among us like a conductor, invisible hands guiding instruments too vast for mortal comprehension. And in his actions I felt the weight of a terrible clarity. The Imperium endured not because it was strong, nor because it was righteous, but because those who understood the lattice were willing to sacrifice themselves in ways even the Emperor could not. It was then, amidst the battles and the whispers, that I realized the truth. The Emperor's apotheosis had been incomplete. Not in failure, but in design. Fragments of his consciousness remained tethered to the throne, each aware, each watching, each serving a purpose beyond comprehension. And in that awareness I glimpsed a paradox. The Imperium was vast, infinite, and yet every action depended on fragile points, on the choir, on the fragments, on warriors like Elion, whose human spark persisted despite centuries of conditioning. The void outside our fleet was not empty. Shadows moved within it, vast and alien, as if the galaxy itself were responding to the strain of the lattice. Demons lingered at the edges of warp storms, sensing weakness, testing boundaries, whispering promises of freedom and dominion. Yet the light of the Astronomicon, fractured though it was, pulsed back against them with a clarity born of suffering. Still here, still serving. The chant was no longer a whisper. It was a war cry, a testament, a shield against the chaos that would devour all, and I knew, finally, that the true battle was not for worlds, nor for fleets, nor for lives. It was for the lattice itself. To fail was to unmake the Imperium in ways no battle could reverse. To succeed was to carry the weight of billions of souls, the whispers of fragments, the dreams of a god who no longer slept, and the silent, infinite devotion of those who had learned what it meant to serve without end. Elion turned to me then, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of the throne, of the choir, of the Emperor himself, not as a distant god, but as a presence that demanded understanding, endurance, and vigilance. The galaxy stretched before us, infinite, dangerous, and merciless. And yet in that terror, in that vastness, I understood why we endured, why we served, why despite the fractures and the blood, the light remained, still here, still serving. The words were no longer echoing. They were a pulse, a rhythm, a command without voice, a truth without form. And as I stood among the Iveth Legion, amidst the shadows of lost systems and dying stars, I realized that the service we gave was not obedience. It was creation. The Imperium endured not because it had survived, but because we carried it forward. One fragment, one whisper, one sacrifice at a time. The fleet moved like a living thing, each ship a vessel of devotion, each pilot a heartbeat in the lattice. I felt the subtle vibrations of the Astronomicon coursing through the hulls, a presence that was not seen but known, a consciousness both intimate and infinite. Elyon stood at the center of it all, unmoving yet directing, his mind a prism through which the light of the throne flowed. I realized then that the Emperor had not abandoned the galaxy. He had dispersed himself, and in dispersal he had multiplied. Each fragment was a sentinel, each whisper a command that no mortal chain could contain. We approached the edge of a void scarred by warp turbulence, a rift where entire systems had been swallowed and rewritten in the image of chaos. The choir's resonance grew stronger here, a lattice of thought, prayer, and memory that braided together into something almost solid. I could feel it pressing against my skull, vibrating in time with the pulse of the Astronomicon. And then I understood. The warp was not an enemy in itself. It was a mirror, reflecting the Imperium's own fragility. The light of the throne held it at bay, not through power alone, but through the devotion of countless minds bound into the lattice. Aboard the flagship, Elyon raised a hand not to give a command, but to direct attention. My mind flared with images. An entire system, its fleet broken, its planetary defenses failing. Yet a single fragment of the Emperor's awareness shimmered above it, guiding the survivors. I felt their fear, their hope, and their instinctive loyalty, each folded into a single strand of purpose. And I realized something terrifying. If that lattice faltered even for a moment, the consequences would not be local. The ripple would spread across light years, unraveling orders, loyalties, and lives in a cascade of chaos. Yet even as the danger pressed in, I sensed an emergence, a subtle anomaly, something not fully comprehensible moving within the warp like a living shadow. It whispered to the fragments, teasing, testing, and yet failing to penetrate the lattice fully. Elyon felt it too. His body stiffened, his eyes narrowing, and though he said nothing, I knew he was preparing us for something beyond mere battle, a confrontation with forces that existed outside the laws of stars and men. I looked out at the Iveth Legion, the warriors silent and patient as statues, their armor reflecting the dim glow of distant suns. They were more than soldiers. They were nodes in a system older than memory, each body, each mind feeding back into the lattice, amplifying the fragment's reach. I realized then that every life lost, every sacrifice made, was absorbed and transformed, not wasted. Even death had meaning here, converted into purpose, reforged into the light that held the Imperium together. And then the choir sang, not with voices, not with instruments, but with thought. A resonance that bent the very air, vibrating through the fleet, threading through warp and real space alike. Still here, still serving. It was no longer a chant, no longer a memory. It was a declaration, a living pulse that both warned and inspired. The fragments stirred, weaving around each other like dancers in a choreography too vast for comprehension. And I understood the enormity of what we were part of. The Emperor's light was fractured, Yes, but in its fracture lay flexibility, resilience, and purpose. A transmission arrived, carried not by Vox or data slate, but by a subtle psychic thread that only those attuned to the lattice could perceive. A world at the rim of the segmentum obscurus, its fleets destroyed, its defenses collapsed. Yet a single fragment of humanity remained. Scientists, soldiers, and survivors, unaware of the war raging across stars, clinging to life with nothing but instinct and ingenuity. The Emperor's fragment whispered guidance, and I felt the ripple as the survivors' actions, small and desperate, aligned with the lattice. A starport rebuilt, a generator restarted, a single shuttle launched into the void with cargo that might one day shift the tide of countless battles. Elyon moved then. The first time I saw him bend the lattice directly. It was not power, not command, it was participation, empathy, integration. The ship's systems responded to his intent. Shields recalibrated before an incoming strike. Engines bent reality itself to dodge what no eye could see. I realized that in moments like this he was not a man among warriors. He was the lattice's will manifest. A bridge between fragments and flesh, between light and the chaos beyond. And yet even as we acted I felt the strain. The fragments whispered of fatigue, of memory slipping, of erosion. The lattice could only sustain so much before the edges frayed. And in that fraying the galaxy became vulnerable. The choir's song, as beautiful as it was, reminded me of a terrible truth. Eternity comes with cost and infinity demands sacrifice. We were not saviors in the traditional sense. We were caretakers of a delicate living architecture whose collapse would erase everything we fought to protect. I turned from the viewports, my mind trembling under the weight of comprehension. Elyon's gaze met mine, and in it I saw no pride, no arrogance, only clarity. He had seen the impermanence of all things, the fragility of the lattice, and yet he moved forward, steady, patient, and unyielding. In that moment I understood what it meant to serve without end, not in obedience, not in devotion, but in constant, conscious choice sustained by will, empathy, and awareness, and the chant followed me still, threading through thought and perception, unbroken, eternal, still here, still serving. It was a reminder that no matter the chaos, no matter the war, no matter the shadows that gnawed at the edges of reality, the fragments endured, humanity endured, the Emperor endured in ways that defied understanding. And I, like all who had touched the lattice, was bound to this endurance, a participant in a struggle whose scale no mortal mind could hold, yet whose outcome would define the fate of stars. The void outside our fleet was no longer empty. Shadows moved within the warp currents, dark shapes that seemed to devour starlight itself. They were not ships, not creatures, not anything I'd ever seen in reality, but they were real enough in the lattice for every fragment of the Emperor felt their presence. They whispered, probing, testing. Their voices carried not through sound but through instinct, through the raw feeling of inevitability. We were intruders in a realm older than the stars, and it wanted us gone. Elyon stood at the bridge, his armor reflecting the dim pulse of the Astronomicon like fractured glass. His mind touched each fragment, weaving guidance and awareness into a single, coherent lattice that spanned light years. Every motion he made, every intention was echoed through the choir. Ships responded before enemy fleets could act. Defenses reconfigured themselves in real time, and yet the shadows pressed closer. They were persistent, intelligent, and utterly alien, bending physics as they moved, unbinding what reality demanded of us. I felt the choir strain. Threads of memory, thought, and devotion began to unravel under the psychic weight. Some fragments flickered and went silent, leaving ghostly voids in the lattice that threatened to destabilize the entire network. And then the Emperor's presence reached into me, warm, infinite, and terrifying. It was not a voice but a perception. Hold the line. Sustain the lattice. Do not fail. And in that single pulse of will, I understood that our survival was not enough. The lattice itself must endure or humanity's light would die. The first strike came without warning. A rift opened in the warp and the shadows surged into real space like a tidal wave made of nightmare. Orc vessels, tyrannid bioships, and demonic constructs collided in an impossible tangle, reality itself warping at their edges. And yet through the lattice Elion guided our fleet as though we were a single body, bending space, redirecting energy, preempting destruction. I could feel my thoughts merged with the choir, our minds fused with the fragments, our wills folded into a single unbreakable purpose. We were everywhere and nowhere at once. A tyrannid bioship tore through the outer lines of the fleet, its massive bulk crushing smaller vessels. Yet from within the lattice, a fragment guided a squadron of interceptors through impossible vectors. They struck at the bioship's tendrils before it could react, exploiting weaknesses no mind could calculate in isolation. The creature shrieked, a sound that tore at nerves as much as it did reality, and the choir absorbed it, converting terror into harmonic resonance, stabilizing the lattice even as we struck back. In the midst of chaos, I glimpsed something extraordinary, a small human colony in the path of the maelstrom, utterly unaware of its imminent destruction. And yet through Elion, through the fragments, guidance reached them. Their engineers rerouted failing power grids, their defenders repositioned in perfect anticipation, and ships launched just in time to escape the devastation. No miracle, no divine intervention, only the subtle, persistent shaping of will, the careful folding of probability across scales that mortal minds could never fathom. The shadows recoiled, hissing through the warp, frustrated by the lattice's resilience. But every action, every adjustment drew more strain. The choir sang louder, a resonance that pressed against thought itself. I felt my skull hum with the effort of holding the threads together, my vision swimming as memory and reality intertwined. Elion did not flinch, his gaze steady. Even as fragments flickered like dying stars, their voices lost to the void. Still here, still serving. The chant became a mantra, a binding force that welded fragments and mortals together into a single instrument of defense. Yet even as we fought, I realized the deeper truth. The Emperor had not merely scattered fragments across the stars. He had created a system that required constant maintenance. Every sacrifice, every prayer, every act of devotion was fuel. The shadows were drawn not only to destruction, but to entropy itself, testing the lattice's integrity. And in that testing I saw the cost. Thousands of choir members burned out in moments, their minds erased, memories and purpose folded into the lattice, leaving hollow echoes in their wake. We were defenders, yes, but also vessels for pain, the living conduits of a machine that spanned the galaxy. A demon of impossible scale emerged from the rift, its presence bending reality, its form a twisted mockery of life. Elion reached out through the lattice, and I felt his intent pierce me. We were not acting alone. Every fragment, every note in the choir, every mind connected to the Astronomicon surged into a single motion of will. Reality itself bent, shaping the demon's trajectory, twisting its assault into the void, erasing it as though it had never existed. The shockwave rippled across systems, tearing smaller ships from the warp and leaving silence in its wake. We had survived, but I knew it was temporary. The shadows would return and the strain would grow. The lattice was strong yet finite, and every battle left new fractures in its integrity. Elion turned to me, his expression unreadable beneath his helm. There was no triumph, no relief, only the infinite patience of one who bore the weight of eternity. He spoke directly into my mind, the words clear and calm. We endure. That is all. and still we serve. And as the fleet regrouped, the stars itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the choir. Every fragment alive, every mind connected, every soul contributing to the melody of defense. I understood at last what it meant to serve a being who was everywhere yet nowhere. To be part of a system beyond mortal comprehension, to be a node in a network whose failure meant oblivion and whose success meant salvation. The void had not been tamed, it had been survived. And as Elyon gazed into the infinite darkness beyond the fleet, I knew this was only the beginning. The war was eternal, the cost unmeasurable, the choir unwavering, and through it all the chant echoed in the marrow of my bones. Still here, still serving. The light from the Astronomicon no longer flickered. It surged, steady and unwavering, yet it carried a new quality, something alive beyond mere guidance. I could feel it in my marrow, vibrating through my bones like a resonant chord struck across the galaxy. The Emperor's fragments, the choir, and I. We were all threads woven into a tapestry that spanned stars. Every act of devotion, every whisper of prayer, every spark of human ingenuity became fuel for the beacon. I watched the Imperium bend, subtly, almost imperceptibly, to a will that was neither tyrannical nor passive. Chaos fleets faltered as if the universe itself resisted them. Orc warbands misfired, their engines sputtering against currents they could not perceive. Even the Tyranid scouts recoiled, confused by a harmony in the warp that had never existed. The galaxy was alive with subtle intervention, and we were instruments of it, unseen but undeniable. And yet in that orchestration, I sensed the fragility. One misaligned thought, one lapse in focus, and the machinery could falter. The choir thinned, voices fading into the void. Yet each loss was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, that vigilance demanded sacrifice, and that even eternity has limits. The throne, magnificent and terrible, held the weight of all humanity. But it was a weight that pressed down not only on flesh, but on the mind and spirit of those bound to it. I felt the fragments stir. Some burned with wrath, sweeping through heretical fleets with precision. Others guided lost fleets through storms with a gentle hand, unseen but vital. Somewhere, in the depths of this collective consciousness, a shard mourned what humanity had become, yet still acted with deliberate clarity. Salvation was never gentle. It was a crucible, and the galaxy's future was forged in that heat. And then I realized, this vigilance, this eternal service, was not mine alone. It was the inheritance of every soul who had ever prayed, sacrificed, or dared to endure. Every being tethered to the Astronomicon, every whisper in the warp, every fragment of devotion became part of something infinite. I understood fully the nature of the Emperor's vision. Redemption was not a single act nor a singular entity, but the sum of all persistence. The light that shone from Terra now reflected not only the Emperor, but all who served, all who endured, all who dreamed against the darkness. The choir fell silent, not in absence, but in unity. The galaxy held its breath. I held mine, a single note within the eternal harmony, knowing that what came next would not be gentle nor predictable but necessary. The imperishable light of the throne pulsed in rhythm with the universe itself, and in that pulse I understood the truth I had long feared. The Emperor's work was never finished, and neither would ours be. The galaxy turned, indifferent yet guided. The Imperium endured, fragile and magnificent, and in the spaces between thought and eternity the Emperor dreamed, not of conquest but of redemption. Chapter 5: The Fractured Light of Eternity. The galaxy exhaled, not with relief, for relief was a luxury long forgotten by the Imperium, but with the slow, tremulous pulse of existence itself, as if the stars themselves recognized the fragile order that had been stitched together beneath the throne. I drifted among the currents of the Astronomicon, no longer bound entirely to flesh, yet tethered to it by memory, devotion, and the hum of psychic resonance that threaded through the choir. Each pulse of the beacon was a breath, each fragment of thought a whisper of eternity. I saw the Imperium from beyond its own borders, and it looked like a living cathedral of flame and shadow. Fleet after fleet moved with purpose, the combined will of billions guiding them through the storms of the warp, avoiding annihilation as if the currents themselves bent to some unseen hand. Worlds that had teetered on the edge of despair now teetered on the edge of awakening, their populations glimpsing hope through the haze of survival. And yet, for all its glory, the galaxy remained impermanent, a fragile lattice of chance and violence poised over an abyss it barely understood. The fragments whispered among themselves, voices overlapping like stars in the sky, some gentle, some harsh, some mournful. I recognized them now, distinct yet inseparable. Wrath that scorched fleets of traitors, wisdom that guided lost navigators, sorrow that mourned the cost of salvation. They were not him, and yet they were his. Every shard bore the memory of 10,000 years, every thought a reflection of purpose tempered by agony, and in the center of this fractal consciousness, the echo of the Emperor himself pulsed with patient authority, watching, waiting, dreaming. Rumors had always clung to the throne, that the golden throne was more than a machine, that fragments of his mind lingered like spectral custodians, that the Astronomicon was both beacon and cage. I had seen enough to know these whispers were true. Not literal prophecy, not idle superstition, but glimpses of a hidden reality that only a few had ever touched, and touching it exacted a toll. I felt the weight of every thought I had ever held, magnified and entwined with the will of the choir. It was both sublime and unbearable. Beyond the throne, beyond the cathedral of light, the warp churned with curiosity and hunger. I sensed them. Demons skittering along the edges of perception, orc warbands seeking carnage, tyrannid scouting tendrils probing for weakness. Yet none could strike decisively, for the galaxy itself had become a battleground of intent, a living testament to the reach of the Emperor's vigilance. Every act of devotion, every whispered prayer, every memory offered in sacrifice was a blade, a shield, a ward against the encroaching darkness. And still, the vision grew. I saw whispers of rebellion in the deep sectors, small sparks of heresy, cults that would one day rise to challenge the light. I saw colonies abandoned, their populations crushed by war or plague. I saw the cost, the infinite ledger of suffering required to sustain the beacon of humanity. And I understood finally the cruel calculus that had always guided the Imperium. Hope was never free, and salvation exacted its toll in flesh, in mind, in devotion. Yet even amid this vast ledger of sacrifice there was beauty. The fragments shared it in glimpses, a child surviving on a world thought lost, a lone battle brother standing firm against impossible odds, a Mechanicus adept discovering a long-forgotten STC, and reviving knowledge thought lost to the void. Small sparks, insignificant in isolation, but in the grand symphony of the choir they became radiant. Purpose was not merely preservation, it was cultivation, guidance, and the recognition that even in endless war life persisted. I drifted further, feeling the pulse of Terra beneath all else. The throne hummed eternal, but it was not silent. Beneath its golden surface, the machinery whispered secrets older than the Imperium itself. Shards of consciousness that had once been human, now eternal, now necessary, carried memories of the first Thunder Warriors, of Project Thunderchild, of the early Astartes who had cried and bled beneath the gaze of the Emperor. They were legion and each remembered. They were fragments of mortality preserved in service, living witnesses to the crucible of creation. A voice reached me then, distinct and clear among the fractal chorus, neither command nor plea but reflection. "What is the measure of eternity?" it asked. It was neither human nor wholly divine, but it carried the weight of all who had ever served. I understood immediately the measure was persistence. The cost was everything. The reward was understanding. To endure was to exist in service, to serve was to exist in eternity. The galaxy continued its turn, unknowing of the watchful presence that threaded through its stars. Civilizations rose and fell, wars burned and cooled, fleets drifted and collided, and yet the Astronomicon persisted. Billions of lives, countless sacrifices, all feeding a single purpose beyond comprehension. Redemption, not conquest. Vigilance, not sovereignty. Guidance, not domination. And I, a witness and participant, felt the unity of the choir as though it were my own heartbeat, resonating through the warp, through the flesh, through the light itself. At the edge of perception, I glimpsed the fragment who had once spoken to me in the selenite deep. Its golden eyes flickered with exhaustion, yet contained the same clarity I remembered. It whispered in thought, not sound, "Remember, we endure, and in enduring they may yet rise." I understood then that the Emperor's vision was not final, not static, not complete. It was a process, eternal, unfolding, and contingent upon those willing to serve without question, without pause, without end. The galaxy spun onward, indifferent yet guided. The Imperium endured, fragile, radiant, and terrible. The choir hummed without voices. The fragments pulsed with remembrance. And in the spaces between time, between thought, between the folds of mortal and divine, the Emperor dreamed. Not of conquest, but of redemption, and in that dream, I too existed, neither fully mortal nor fully divine. Yet a part of all that must persist. And as I faded into that pulse, the echo of countless souls vibrating in harmony, I understood the final truth. Eternity is not owned. It is served.